It was a typical afternoon in a small Ohio grocery store, the hum of everyday life filling the air. People moved about, carts rattling across the polished floors, some lost in thought, others exchanging quiet pleasantries. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the aisles. In this familiar setting, the mundane was about to be shattered by a confrontation that no one expected. In the produce section, an elderly woman stood, adjusting her glasses with an air of impatience. She muttered under her breath, clearly frustrated as she reached for a bag of apples. Dressed in a faded cardigan and with her silver hair neatly pinned, she appeared harmless enough until her words cut through the calm. Meanwhile, a young black man, Daryl, was moving through the aisles. Tall and dressed in a blue hoodie and jeans, he seemed to blend in with the ordinary shoppers. He was texting on his phone, juggling a basket of groceries in his other hand, unaware of the storm that was about to break. As he reached for a bag of oranges near the woman, her gaze snapped toward him, her expression suddenly hardening. There was no mistaking it. Her look was one of disdain, her eyes narrowing as she stood tall, clutching her apples as if they were her last line of defense. "You people don't belong here," she muttered loudly enough for others to hear. The words hung in the air, sharp and biting. Daryl froze. His fingers hovered over his phone as his eyes met hers. Before he could respond, the woman's voice sliced through the stillness again, more venomous this time. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The store fell silent, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of her words. A few shoppers halted mid-step, their eyes darting around the room. Others looked away in discomfort. The usual rhythm of the market had been replaced by an almost tangible tension, one that stretched too long and suffocated the air. Daryl stood there, momentarily frozen. Shocked? Yes, but also calculating. His mind raced through the possible responses. He could shout back, he could storm off, or he could stay silent. Yet none of these felt right. His expression remained unreadable, his face calm, but there was a storm in his eyes. The woman's presence was unyielding, her stance demanding no response, only compliance. A young mother quickly pulled her child away, while an older man, near the potatoes, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Daryl and the woman, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence was palpable, an oppressive weight settling in on everyone in the vicinity. They were now witnesses, each one unsure whether to intervene or stay on the sidelines. Daryl's grip tightened on his grocery basket. The world around him seemed to narrow, every sound muffled, every gaze fixed on him. The words the woman had spoken hovered in the air like a stench, one that no one could escape. But Daryl didn't break. He took a breath, steadying himself, and without missing a beat, shifted his basket to the other hand and squared his shoulders. His presence seemed to grow in the silence, as if he was filling up the entire aisle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but every word cut through the tension like a blade. "Ma'am," he began, his tone controlled but firm, "do you even realize what you just said?" It wasn't an accusation, but a question, one that gave her a moment to think, to reflect. But she wasn't interested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising in defiance. "This is my country, and people like you don't belong here." The words were final. They were meant to end the conversation, to shut him down. But they didn't. A young woman nearby, stocking the bread, hesitated, her eyes shifting between the two, uncertain whether to get involved. The cashier looked over, craning her neck, caught between duty and indecision. The tension in the air thickened as the crowd of silent witnesses waited for Daryl's response. The air in the store seemed heavier as the silence stretched on, thick with tension. Shoppers who had been discreetly watching now openly stared, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Daryl, however, stood calm, his composure unwavering. He didn't flinch, didn't lash out. Instead, he let the pause settle, the woman's words reverberating in the stillness, giving them time to sink into the ears and hearts of everyone present. Finally, with a deliberate nod, he spoke, his tone steady but resolute. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The crowd collectively held its breath. No one moved, not even those who had tried to pretend they weren't listening. Daryl carefully set his basket on the floor, the motion slow and deliberate, as if grounding himself for what he was about to say. His presence seemed to grow in the quiet aisle, pulling everyone closer, even the ones who wished to shrink away. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his gaze fixed on the elderly woman, not with anger, but with a quiet determination that made her shift uncomfortably. "Let me tell you something about where I come from." His voice carried a weight that demanded attention, each word deliberate, chosen with care. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he continued, pausing for just a moment to let the words settle. "He was a sharecropper, breaking his back on land he didn't own, so his children could have a chance at a better life. His father? He was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, sold like property. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't speak. The crowd, however, was riveted. A man near the dairy section, who had been scrolling on his phone, lowered it without realizing. An older couple whispered to each other, but kept their eyes glued to the unfolding scene. "My grandfather," Daryl continued, his voice gaining strength, "fought in World War II. He risked his life for a country that treated him like dirt when he came home. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains, but he stayed. You know why?" His eyes softened, though his voice never wavered. "Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." A hush fell over the store. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade. Every word carried weight, and every pause seemed to echo louder than any shout could. "And my parents," he said, his voice dropping slightly, though it lost none of its intensity, "they fought too, not with guns or fists, but by working every single day. My mom's a teacher. She spent her entire life helping kids, no matter what they look like or where they come from. My dad? He's a mechanic, the kind of man who'd stop to help someone like you if your car broke down on the side of the road." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, his eyes locked on the woman. "So you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly, his voice now carrying a hint of sadness. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it, in blood, sweat, and tears." The woman's face flushed. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bag of apples, her expression a mix of anger, embarrassment, and something deeper, something that almost resembled shame. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but stopped, her words catching in her throat. Daryl stepped back slightly, his composure unshaken, his voice calm yet firm. "I could have walked away," he said, glancing briefly at the crowd that had gathered around them. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, better than words like those." The weight of his words lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. For a moment the store seemed frozen in time. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally the silence was broken, not by the elderly woman, but by a middle-aged man in a baseball cap who had been standing near the frozen foods. He stepped forward, his voice steady but quiet. "He's right," the man said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "We've got to be better than this." His statement seemed to break a spell. A woman near the bread aisle nodded, her voice trembling as she added, "My dad fought in that same war. He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the crowd. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by something different, introspection, perhaps, or solidarity. The elderly woman stood silently, clutching her apples, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for an ally. None came. The murmurs in the store grew louder as the moment stretched on. A young cashier, no older than 20, broke the silence from her station, her voice filled with admiration. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you." The elderly woman, now visibly flustered, clutched her shopping cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. Her voice, when it finally came, was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean," she began, but stopped herself, unsure of how to finish. Daryl turned to face her again, his expression softening. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more. The tension in the air finally broke when a man from the deli counter began clapping slowly. It was hesitant at first, but then others joined in, the sound swelling into something undeniable. The applause was not just for Daryl's words, but for the strength it took to confront hatred with dignity. The elderly woman stood there for a moment longer, her face pale. She glanced around the room as if searching for some kind of support, but none came. With a quiet huff, she turned and wheeled her cart toward the exit, her departure unceremonious. As she left, a few people moved toward Daryl. One woman placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Daryl smiled faintly, lifting his basket back into his hand. "Sometimes," he said quietly, almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension lifting from the room, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. Some were inspired, others thoughtful, but everyone seemed changed in some way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Daryl's words lingered. As the shoppers returned to their routines, the atmosphere in the grocery store felt different, quieter, more considerate. Daryl continued his shopping, his steps measured as he processed everything that had just unfolded. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken him, but it had left him reflective. At the checkout, the young cashier, who had spoken up earlier, scanned his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there," she hesitated before continuing, "it meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Daryl smiled back at her, his voice warm. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls." Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Daryl walked toward his car, he noticed the elderly woman sitting in her vehicle, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a brief moment, he considered walking over to her, but decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Daryl sat at the kitchen table with his father, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, listened intently, his hands folded on the table. "You did the right thing, son," his father said finally. "Not just for you, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, they might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow." Daryl nodded, his father's words sinking in deeply. He realized that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it had been necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only lets it fester. Meanwhile, across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, staring at an untouched plate of food. Daryl's words echoed in her mind, each one piercing through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren and the world they were growing up in. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar: doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened in the grocery store spread throughout the neighborhood. People talked about Daryl's response, his courage, and the dignity with which he handled the situation. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what's right. Daryl never sought attention for his actions, but they rippled through the community in ways he hadn't expected. Strangers would stop him on the street, offer a word of thanks, or simply nod in silent acknowledgement. The encounter may have been small in the grand scheme of things, but its impact would be felt for a long time to come. In the days that followed, many approached Daryl with gratitude, sharing their own stories of prejudice, resilience, and moments of personal change. His quiet stand had sparked important conversations, conversations that had long been avoided or brushed aside. The elderly woman, too, began to change. It wasn't immediate, but slowly she started questioning the beliefs she had held for so long. She didn't know if she would ever see Daryl again, but if she did, she hoped she would find the courage to apologize. Moments like these serve as powerful reminders of the strength found in kindness, the power of truth, and the quiet courage needed to challenge ignorance. They show us that standing up doesn't always mean raising our voices. It can simply mean speaking with calm conviction, allowing the truth to speak for itself. To everyone who has witnessed this, let it be a reminder. Your words and actions matter. They can either harm or heal. They can divide or unite. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding, helping to build a more compassionate world for us all.